Welcome to everybody here at the Asser Institute for the colloquium or panel discussion, Diplomacy and the Practice of International Law in Roman Antiquity. We have two papers and afterwards there's time for Q&A. The papers will be recorded, Q&A will not be recorded, so just let you know. One paper by Emilia, Mataix, Ferrándiz, sitting next to me. But we start with the paper by Giltaij, associate professor at the University of Amsterdam, law faculty. Also director of the Paul Scholten Center, one of the organizers of this panel discussion, right? Lately he writes a lot on slavery in the former colonies, especially on the Roman law elements in the slavery law. Published a book very recently, 2 weeks ago. It came out, I think, called Augustus and the Invention of Public Law. Today he will have his paper on theory of international law based, if I'm correctly, based on the understanding that Roman Empire was some kind of, it had a fixed population and territory. It had this idea of jus gentium. And so the question is, can we say there was something like international law in Roman antiquity? Jacob?
Thank you very much.
You have the floor.
So, good afternoon, everyone, on this lovely day. I think it's on now. So the deceptively simple question I'm posing to you is, was there an international law in Roman antiquity? The answer to this question should be simple, but it isn't. The first thing I would like to take a look at is actually look at current definitions of international law. When we say, is there an international law in any earlier period in history, what do we mean by international law? Does the definition of international law entail in what period we can place its origin or its existence? The second question I ask is, how is Roman antiquity represented in what I would term the handbook narrative? So let's say general handbooks on history and theory of international law. Do we see anything in those handbooks that say, well, yes, indeed, there is something like international law and in Roman antiquity? And my third question is, okay, and what about Roman law scholars? Have Roman law scholars, or scholars of Roman antiquity more in general, have they viewed this period and said, well, yes, looking at these and these and these documents, there is something that is akin to our modern international law? Or have they said, well, this is the international law in this period simply did not exist? So in these discussions, a single term keeps popping up, and that term is jus gentium, I think literally translatable as law of nations, the Latin term for law of nations. This is a very problematic term, and I will reiterate the usage of this term constantly throughout this presentation, but this term logically will be central to this presentation. Now, if we put these questions together, so handbook narrative, current definition of international law, and Romanist scholarship, I can tell you there are basically two ideas of scholarship emerging on this problem of international law in antiquity. There's a minimalist strand, in which I would include the handbook narrative itself, and there is a maximalist scholarly narrative. And in this part of the presentation, I will set out these two strands of scholarship and then look at how that notion of jus gentium fits into that minimalist versus maximalist debate on international law in Roman antiquity. I will conclude, I will ask the same question, this again, deceptively simple question again, but I will juxtapose law or legal regulations, legal norms in Roman antiquity with practice and ask the question again. And at this part, I will hand to Emilia, who will discuss the more practical matter of diplomacy in this sort of theoretical context of the problem of international law in antiquity. So everyone's still on board? So let's look at a current definition of international law. There's a, international law is defined all over the place by a lot of people. I will, from a historical point of view, I always like Stephen Neff. Stephen Neff, this is simply from a modern handbook of international law, not from a historical handbook or anything, just a modern handbook of international law. And in this definition, Neff connects the point of origin to the definition of international law. So for example, Neff states, well, international law, if we look at this as a substantive code applying to nations, whatever this may mean, but a substantive code applying to nations, there is a reason to suspect that international law originated in a classic period or in the Middle Ages. However, if we take states as the defining hallmark of international law, a law between states, then we are really in the 17th century. There's no such thing as a state before the 17th century. However, if we take the idea of a single community of states under a shared law, then the 19th century is the point of origin of international law. So just to illustrate, the problem of origin and of definition, these two are very much related. It very much depends on how you define something, where the origin of it is placed. And also, this definition of Neff can be criticized, because I would say, well, nowadays, if we look at international law, states are very much no longer, well, the sole actors, maybe not even the main actors in international law. So, I mean, does this then mean that there was no such thing as 17th century, as international law in the 17th century suddenly? And I think in antiquity, there certainly is this idea, whether or not it was there in practice, of a single community that lived under a shared law. So does this mean we should actually now place the 19th century idea in antiquity, right? So if you play with these aspects, these hallmarks of a definition of international law, you can trace its origin, you can argue at least for its origin in a variety of different periods. What I would, however, say is that I do think that this handbook image, and this for me represents the handbook image of international law, this is the Security Council, and this is the image, at least, of the Peace of Westphalia. I would say, well, this image of, old white men sitting in a room wearing sometimes wigs, usually suits or some, official attire, subdividing countries and, creating these new world orders. I would say that's a handbook narrative that I would want to get away from nowadays. I don't think that's how international law is created in whichever definition we are using. So let's look at this handbook narrative. I think indeed there are as much definitions as there are histories. I think the clearest one I like when it comes to handbook narratives is Lassa Oppenheim. So this is early 20th century, and he's very clear. No international law in antiquity. A very easy answer to the question. However, if you look at the development, sort of the evolution of including antiquity in handbook narratives of international law, I think one thing is really noticeable is that after the Second World War, the notion of jus gentium is constantly taken as a starting point. And you can see this, I've put down a Nussbaum, 1947, right? No coincidence, 2 years after the Second World War. And this is certainly not an isolated incident. I've published separately on these sort of late Second World War, post-Second World War sort of re-uptakes of jus gentium as this sort of hallmark, this sort of basic idea of international law, whether or not that amounted to international law in antiquity itself. So what is jus gentium? So why is it seen as this, forebearer of international law, especially after the Second World War? Well, it's basically because of its universal application. So we see definitions of jus gentium, so literally translatable as law of nations or Völkerrecht, and this is, seen in handbook narratives regularly as a predecessor to international law because of its universal application. It is applied the same everywhere, and it's juxtaposed in Roman antiquity explicitly with the so-called jus civile, so the law proper to Roman citizens, I would say. So in modern handbooks, in general, Roman antiquity is sometimes kind of included as a predecessor to development of international law. Jus gentium is a very important notion, but it's usually seen as a prehistoric or a primitive state of international law. Roman law experts tend to disagree with that. I think Roman law experts, broadly speaking, classicists, are very early on discuss ideas of international law in antiquity in general, in Roman antiquity in particular, in their works, and they usually put that in the frame of a relation between Rijksrecht and Volksrecht, or the law of the Roman Empire and the law of local peoples. And this juxtaposition has led to basically a 100-year-long discussion on whether there was such a thing as international law in Roman law or in Roman antiquity in general. This debate was not altered significantly by the Second World War, but it was altered significantly by archaeological finds, especially ones done in the 80s. So we can see that in the works of Dieter Neur, I think one of the main experts on international law in Roman antiquity. And after the 1980s, we see a significant more positive attitude towards the existence of a lot of types of international law in Roman antiquity because we had new information, right? It's weird, right? The legal history tends to be seen as not changing. Legal history changes all the time. For example, when it comes to archaeological finds in the 80s. So bringing these three matters together, so current definitions of international law, the handbook narrative of international law, and the Romanist, well, let's say critique, I think generally speaking, nowadays, there are two scholarly narratives when it comes to placing the origin of international law or a concept of international law in Roman antiquity. There's a minimalist narrative, to which I would include the handbook narrative. It usually does not include Roman antiquity. And it usually states that if there was such a thing as something akin to international law, it's international law and a primitive state. And the maximalist strand has very much argued against this. In this maximalist narrative, I would say the main idea is that these people in that maximalist narrative, I've put a chronological overview of them on this slide, is that they try to bring the Romanist ideas, so the Roman law expertise, together with the handbook narrative. And in this, I would say it is also very much a German occupation. I would name the names of Wolfgang Preiser, already in 1978, Karl-Heinz Ziegler, I think a major expert on the history of international law, generally speaking, and especially in antiquity, Christian Baldes, former director of the Max Planck in Heidelberg, and Nadine Grootkamp, are also, so people with a German background who have adhered to this maximalist narrative of placing antiquity in this handbook narrative of international law. So how do these maximalists, for example, Preiser and Baldes, view the idea of international law? I've included the definition of Wolfgang Preiser, which was translated and to which Baldes agrees with it. It's translated by Baldes, and Baldes agrees with it here. And you can see, well, they tend to not refer to states as the main actors in international law, but subjects of equal rank. States are, according to them, an anachronistic notion, but there's too much going on in antiquity that has a similar function, so you cannot ignore it. So they use the term subjects of equal rank. They focus on treaty law. I think also very much from a modern perspective, one of the main sort of bodies of law included in international law is treaty law, very easily traceable in antiquity as well. I think Emilia will say a little bit more about that. And they focus on how are, the subjects of equal rank kept to their obligations without there being a coercion, from above or from elsewhere. How are they sort of coercing these, holding themselves to these obligations created by this treaty law, and between these subjects of equal rank, because no subject is of higher rank and therefore cannot, coerce other subjects to be kept to it. And this is already a problem when we start looking at Roman antiquity, because in Roman antiquity, in sort of the area that we're discussing right now, there's this huge hegemony of the Roman Empire. There is no subject of equal rank in the terminology of Preiser compared to the Roman Empire, so in the Mediterranean in this period. Obviously, there are other empires, but the context with those cannot amount to an international law, possibly, right? So what are we talking about? This is an overview of the periods I am discussing. I'm looking at the late Republic and early Empire. In this period, in the Roman Empire, in the late Republic as well, but mainly in the Roman Empire, the main actors in the government of the Romans are so in the government of the empire are the provincial governors, so the proconsules. We can see a lot of law and legal regulations and judicial decisions emanating from that office. These governors, they also tend to possess legal knowledge. I would generally say that the Roman Empire, for better or worse, is an empire run through law. These provincial governors maybe unexpectedly adhere to legal norms. Therefore, we can also see theory shaping done by these provincial governors and with regard to these provincial governors. And it is in this period that jus gentium, as a legal notion, maybe akin to international law, is developed. Can be found in the legal sources. So we're talking about this area, huge sort of mass. I don't think the Roman Empire was in the top 10 empires by size in the world, but it's an enormous empire nonetheless. And all over this empire, there are provincial governors, and these are the people that sort of do the practicalities of the day-by-day running of the empire outside of Rome, right? And so in this period and in this area, the jus gentium rises and is developed as a legal notion, but it's a very problematic notion. It's mentioned in historical sources, so I mentioned Cicero and Livy here, but in the juristic sources, there is no singular definition of what jus gentium is. So if we look, for example, to the oldest, I don't think you can read this text, but this is the oldest juristic text, so not Roman text, but juristic text in which the jus gentium is mentioned. Well, if you look at this text, this is actually a text that does not even concern anything, does not have anything to do with the law of nations or international law or anything. The term jus gentium here is used as a synonym for straightforward, for self-evident. So in the oldest juristic text pertaining to the jus gentium, that hugely important notion that is so-called, right, the first idea of international law, jus gentium means straightforward in at least the first juristic text that we have, so the oldest one. So in later texts, not much later, but later text nonetheless, I don't think you can read this either. These are three texts. The first two texts are of Gaius and Ulpian, so later jurists. I think Gaius mid-2nd century AD, Ulpian early 3rd century AD. In these two texts, jus gentium does really clearly have that connotation of being universally applicable, and also something that's juxtaposed in Gaius to jus civile, so the law proper to Romans, and in Ulpian even to natural law. Ulpian has a relation between jus gentium and natural law, which I think is very surprising, and he distinguishes the two. So this is I think very interesting. So there is some theory shaping, at least, on jus gentium in the sense of this universal applicability. However, these two texts are also from so-called institutiones, and institutiones are teaching manuals. So this means that these may or may not be distinctions, definitions that were related to Roman law in practice, but at least as they were put in these texts, they were meant to educate students, right? They were meant to say something to students about how Roman law functioned, not reflect any so-called reality of Roman law. We have a third text where there actually is a substantive definition of jus gentium. Hermogenium, again a later jurist, so mid-3rd century AD, mentions several sort of constituent parts of jus gentium, and very interesting, he mentions both, let's say, public international law things as well as private international law things. So treaties, he mentions treaties, but he also mentions the contract of buying and selling, for example, something that Romans would see as something private, right? Also, as we would now do too. So again, also these sort of hugely influential, very interesting definitions of jus gentium are very problematic. So are we seeing, you know, archfathers or even definitions of international law in these texts? So so at the very least, I would say it's worthy of discussions. So in my view, the question of whether there is an international law in antiquity, the definition, the idea of jus gentium is a red herring, right? It's a misleading clue. It's something that may indicate international law. Maybe it was international law, that's fine, but it's not something I would look for before anything else. And what we would rather what we should take a look at, in my view, is not legal theory or the legal theory of the Romans, but legal practice. What were the international legal norms in practice, and can we distill an idea of international law from that, rather than, you know, being blinded by this flashy definition of jus gentium. So to conclude, and then I will give the word to Emilia, there is no field, quotation marks, of international law in Roman antiquity. Depending on the definition, theory shaping on international law in Roman antiquity is minimal. It's there, but it's minimal. And I would rather look at Cicero than, for example, the later jurists for that. I think they're very much derivative of, for example, Cicero. Jus gentium may have indicated some form of international law, but in my view, it's a red herring. It's not something you should, you know, point to as the culprit and the be-all and end-all of everything. The legal context of jus gentium, I would say, but this is not very clear from the text, is one inside the empire. So this is rather a universal set of norms, but inside the empire, not between the empire and, for example, other empires, such as the Persian Empire or the Carthaginian Empire. There are examples. However, this does not mean there is no international law in practice. And for that, I would like to give the floor to our colleague, Emilia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Interesting paper on minimalist and maximalist views on the question of international law in antiquity, the interconnection between definition and the origin of international law. I find very interesting. The same with jus gentium. What do we see as jus gentium? And in the end, it turned out to be mainly an introduction to the next paper of Emilia. Also associate professor of Roman law at the International University of Catalonia in Barcelona, specialist on the intersection between law and archaeology, if you could say so. Published a book some years ago, 23, 22, I don't know, on shipwrecks.
2022, yeah,
22,
thank you.
On the Mediterranean Sea, and what they tell us, just to give you an impression, what these shipwrecks tell us on the concepts of law, the concepts of the sea and land mainly. Yeah, okay. She will talk about diplomatic practice in Roman antiquity. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and well, thanks for the invitation. Thank you, Jacob, for organizing all this. And well, I would like to start my talk with this image. I hope that you see it well. It's a painting by Jean-François Legrenet, painted at the end of the 18th century. And here he depicts a very famous episode that depicts diplomatic practices. So basically, this is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who actually was a member of the Seleucid Empire, a rival of the Romans we are talking about the second century BCE. And here what happened is like Antiochus had successfully invaded Egypt, and he was like going forward, and the Romans will fear that it will eventually take Alexandria. So Rome had just defeated Perseus of Macedonia at the Battle of Pydna, and basically they did not want the Seleucid Empire to grow faster and, and became the dominant power in the Mediterranean. So they gave one single instruction to Popilius, the envoy or ambassador, that he should withdraw Antiochus from Egypt. So they gathered together, and here Polybius and then Livy said that Antiochus, as he has painted here, greeted Popilius with, by sharing his hand, like in a gesture of like friendship, like trying to shake his hand. But Popilius instead saying very reluctantly that no, he's not there for making any friends or anything. And instead he was very clear, gave his instructions, and then symbolically drew a circle around Antiochus and said that, very symbolically said that, you should give me an answer that I should give to the Senate before you get out of this circle. So Antiochus realized that with this victory of Rome, actually he did not have any other choice. So in the end, he basically agreed with the proposition of the Romans to withdraw from Egypt, and that is the end of the story, as the sources tell us, right? Why I'm bringing up this episode that it will be also like brought up in my talk, because I think, what would you say here that makes this scene diplomatic and not military? Not only the symbolic gesture of the hand, also the symbolic gesture of the circle, but also that we can see here that there is also, the authority of the ambassador that draws this circle in order to coerce. And basically another thing that I think reflects the period in which this was painted. So basically when Lagrené painted this, it was the illustration. What he wanted to show here was the authority of law expressed through ritual and symbolism, but it was backed by political and military power. That was actually what made Antiochus to withdraw from Egypt. So this is the start of the story I want to tell you, how actually diplomacy is a game, as Jacob has in this talk, about praxis, and diversity and unequal powers in many ways. So when we study international law in antiquity, there's always the temptation to begin from the modern model. So was there an international law in antiquity? We look for sovereign equality, we look for permanent diplomatic missions, we look for foreign ministries, consulates, international conventions, or formal diplomatic recognition. But if we begin here, of course, the ancient world can feel primitive, can feel fragmented, can feel like rudimentary. But I will say that this is the wrong starting point. The better question is not whether Greeks and Romans had international law in the modern sense. The question is, how did communities, kingdoms, cities, empires, and foreign peoples actually manage their relations? So it's a question of praxis, actually. Diplomacy in that sense is especially useful because it allows us to see interstate law in actions. It shows how political communities negotiated, how they communicated, how they concluded agreements, they tried to avoid war, or how they managed in the case that there was already a war going on. And ancient diplomacy was not based in a principle of sovereign equality. Actually, the painting that I have just showed you showed that there was no sovereign equality, nor it was organized through permanent diplomatic institutions, but this does not mean that it lacked norms. On the contrary, diplomatic practice depended on recognized expectations. Envoys should be received, messages should be delivered, treaties should be respected, oaths mattered, hostages could secure compliance, gifts should create obligations, hospitality could frame political relations. So diplomacy allows us to move beyond a sterile yes or no question about if international law was a reality in antiquity. It allows us to examine the concrete mechanisms by which interstate order was produced. So the first point I want to make is that ancient diplomacy was different from modern diplomacy, but the difference should not be confused with simplicity. Modern diplomacy is linked to the modern state, so it depends on permanent missions, professional diplomats, diplomatic law, and bureaucratic structures. In the ancient world, we normally don't find any of this. It was way more ad hoc. Embassies were normally sent for a specific purpose. Envoys did not belong to any professional diplomatic service. In general, they could be provincial governors, as Jacob has mentioned. It could be, intellectuals. It could be political actors. It could be members of elite families, actually. And even in the late Roman Empire, we can finally the action of the church that also mirrors in a way the actions of the state. So we can find also bishops as acting as diplomatic actors. So, and also diplomatic relations were also shaped by inequality. Rome did not actually normally imagine itself as one sovereign state among equal sovereign states. In fact, Rome normally tend to perceive itself as, a sovereign country among lesser sovereign countries. The problem is when the Persians start growing, then they find an enemy of their own rank. So Rome normally acted in a position of superiority, and it shaped the way that embassies were received, the treaties were negotiated, and foreign communities were classified. But this flexibility then doesn't mean a lack of sophistication. Ancient diplomacy worked through a different institutional logic. It was personal, it was ritualized, it was religious, it was legal, and political at the same time. So this is why we should think to study ancient diplomacy not as a failed version of the modern diplomacy, but as a historically specific system of interstate practice. The second point should be understood is that ancient diplomacy should be understood as praxis. I have repeated several times, but it's a praxis and it's not a science. Let's understand that. There's no method, there's no handbook. Actually, for example, like Jacob has just mentioned, the book of Ulpian on the duties of the ambassadors. But actually, that book basically treats about their immunity. So it actually is not a handbook to say, you should behave in that way. The Romans, they were not really organized in that way. Even their provincial governors, they didn't know many times how to behave. So it's really a question of like, going there, trying to do something, sometimes failing horribly, sending desperate letters to the emperor saying, like, what do I do now? The Christians are rebelling, the Jews are rebelling, I don't know what to do. So it's a lot of ad hoc policies. It's very fun and it's very, how to say that? Very, sorry, I don't know how to use that, what term to use there. So these actors included embassies, heralds, and they also had like treaties, oaths, and gifts, etc., and rituals of reception. So some of these practices may seem legal to us. Treaties, for example, obviously invite legal analysis, and actually we have, especially from Greece, we have like 400 treaties that have survived through literature and inscriptions. So others seem more social or symbolic, like gifts, for example. Gifts is still a very complicated issue to understand nowadays, so imagine in antiquity. Or ritual gestures, for example, in the painting we have like offering the hand and then drawing the circle. So in the ancient world, all these categories intermingle many times. A gift should create obligation, like hospitality could structure relationships between communities. An oath can reinforce a treaty. A hostage can guarantee a performance, or a marriage could transform a private institution into a diplomatic tool. For example, drawing an example from Roman history, when Scipio, that was later known as the Africanus, conquered Carthago Nova, or New Carthage in Spain, he was offered a young girl, supposedly very beautiful according to Livy, as a gift. He refused, but then he realized that this girl was betrothed to a Celtiberian chief, or like descendant of a very important family of Celtiberians. So he called Alicius, I think was his name, to his presence, and they offer like the gold that they have for the betrothal as an offer to the conqueror. But he refused it, well, depending on the version. Some versions say that he refused them and gave them to the young couple. Other versions said that he reluctantly refused, but then he accepted it, so I'm not really sure about that. But anyway, the thing is like, anyway, he refused the girl as a gift, and they could happily marry and everything. Supposedly the next day, in a thankful gesture for what he had done, the Celtiberians sent troops for helping me. So this marriage that was a private institution became a diplomatic institution, because then it became that the Celtiberians became allies of the Roman, thanks to this ritual and very emotional gesture of like saying no to the girl as a gift. So the key point here is as well that practices produce expectations. Like treaties, for example, told the practice how they were supposed to behave, what counted as a proper conduct, and what could be perceived as violation, insult, or bad faith or betrayal. So diplomacy is a lot about communication, but it's also about normative practices. Regarding the actors, who did diplomacy? Diplomacy was not monopolized by professional diplomats, as we can imagine. It was conducted by a wide range of actors, for example, rulers or political leaders that we could imagine, but they could also be prominent citizens or civic elites, orators, heralds, interpreters as well. For example, there are episodes of Alexander the Great walking towards Egypt with his two interpreters, and going to lands where practically nobody speaks Greek. So the interpreters were part of the game as well, and they are telling the story of how diplomacy was conducted. But in Rome as well, early diplomatic practice was very connected with religion, especially through what is called the Colleague of the Fetiales, who were involved in the ritual framework of war, peace, and treaty making. Later, especially in the Republic and in the Empire, diplomacy became more explicitly political and military, but the older religious language did not disappear completely. So hostages as well, this is a very key because the difference between hostages, how I understand them nowadays, and hostages, how I understand in antiquity, is very different. They were not prisoners. We could not understand them as prisoners, I will say, because in some contexts, they were generally just the starting point of a conversation. They were just a warranty that the treaty was to be followed, that the treaty was going to be, the parties were going to get together and agree. And in many occasions, they became parts of a political connection. For example, also one thing that is important here is like nowadays, because we have a concept of human rights and the value of human lives, anyone can be a hostage. You can go to Iran. For example, I can go to Iran, get captured there, and well, I hope my government will claim me as a Spanish citizen, even if I'm not that important. That will not happen in antiquity. Okay, a hostage should be someone important, should be a member of an elite family, should be a politician, should be an intellectual leader or something like that. Someone who can play in the game. In this case, for example, one example I would like to give you that is a very problematic one is the case of Demetrius of Macedon. Rome had defeated Perseus in the war of in the Second Macedonian War, and as a way that the treaties will be accomplished, the king of Macedonia decided to send his younger son, not the aspirant to the throne, but the younger son, to Rome. He spent like 6 years there, and there's a lot of theories of like this was a move of the Romans to Romanize and get him like to be like a spy or something. The case is like the guy became very, very acquainted with senators, with political leaders, and he became very prone to the Romans. And when he came back to Macedonia, the father realized that he had become a really great acquaintance with to have like an alliance with the Romans. What happened? The aspirant to the throne, the brother, was not happy with that. So he forged, according to the literature, some proof that he was a traitor, that he was a spy of the Romans, and the father got him killed. That actually, when he, with Perseus, the older brother, became the king, that supposed like a breach with the Romans, and that started the Third Macedonian War. So actually a hostage was a key role here. And for example, they have not been so silly and they have kept with the alliance. We can see how a hostage, or supposedly a prisoner, we call it in modern terms, became an ally, cultural ally to the power that was in front of you. So also in late antiquity, we see more complexity, because it's true that the fact that many of these actors recurrently did this sort of embassies or missions, it became kind of like more bureaucratized or professionalized in a way, not arriving to the terms of we have today, but in a bit more, more like organized way. And also I have to say that, as I said before, ecclesiastical actors became involved. They mirror a bit the conduct of the state, but they also acted as representative or mediators. So although there was not a professional diplomatic corps in the modern sense, ancient diplomacy involved a dense and varied world of diplomatic actors. Embassies were the most visible diplomatic mechanism, but they were not permanent missions. They were usually temporary and set for a particular purpose. So to negotiate peace, to ask for help, to complain, to request privileges, to deliver instructions, etc. In the Roman world, embassies show us the blurred line between diplomacy and imperial administration. Why? Because embassies were not only powers that came from, abroad the limits of Rome, also cities in their own, like Jacob has just shown us a map of the Roman Empire. Cities being part of the Roman Empire can send their embassies. The problem is, like as we said, there's no equality here. There's not sovereign equality as we understand nowadays. So, for example, depending if you are an ally, an ally or a non-ally, it will really depend on the way you receive, how you will receive, by whom, where, etc. So, for example, what we know is that the embassies coming from countries outside the Roman Empire that were allies to Rome, they will enter in the Pomerium, so the frontier that marked the limits of the city of Rome. The ones that were not allies to Rome, they will wait in the Villa Publica, that according to the recent study by Caius Tuori and Johan Heikkinen, supposedly was a wall space also to protect them, because even there was immunity, sometimes it could not be guaranteed. And also, it really depends on the status, because we have the case, for example, of Philo of Alexandria, an intellectual from Alexandria, as his name says, representing the Jews of Alexandria and coming to the Emperor Caligula to ask for, for some help for their community in Egypt. And what the sources tell us is that Caligula, the emperor, basically was very distracted looking at the buildings and did not pay attention to the embassies. So that shows actually the arrogance of a Roman emperor saying that, well, yeah, I will receive you, but you're not that important to deserve my attention. So there is not an equality because of the role of the embassy itself, as we could understand nowadays. One of the more interesting questions here, there will be also this diplomatic immunity. As I have said before, this Treaty of Ulpian, this jurist of the 3rd century, is basically a treaty. It's a title inside the digest that basically talks about diplomatic immunity. We should understand evidently that at this point of my conversation, there was not a fully developed modern law of diplomatic immunity, but the idea that envoys should be protected, it was a recognized and powerful idea. Heralds, for example, enjoyed religious protection, and envoys and ambassadors also came to be protected by interstate custom. So Roman jurists describe them as part of this jus gentium that we'll talk, I guess, now more, because jus gentium is this term that is kind of like a box where you put everything that relates to addressing people who are non-Roman, because it's a very complicated term, actually. But this actually will not mean that envoys were always safe. Diplomatic norms could be violated, especially in moments of crisis, war, and asymmetric powers. But the very fact that violations were remembered, condemned, or legally discussed in the sources shows that there was an expectation of protection, even if there was not heavily regulated. Hospitality was central here, and diplomats are normally treated as guests, and this connects diplomacy that will be considered more like a public practice with private practices of hospitality and guest friendship. I will talk later about this dichotomy between public and private that is essential for understanding diplomacy in antiquity. So why there was a protection of envoys? Just because of the sake of their good heart, because they were humans. No, not really because of that. It was basically because even enemies needed a channel of communication. If they could not move, there was no information flowing. There was no way to know if the treaty was going to be followed or not. So it was this way. And also because of, in order to protect my own envoys, I should respect the envoys that people are coming. So it was kind of like a reciprocity, I think, as well. In terms of the tools that they were using, they have all these sets of instruments that we can find here, and some of them, well, most of them, they will look very familiar to us. So treaties are the clearest example. They can do many things. They could formalize peace, alliance, friendship, territorial arrangement, etc. And actually, as it happens nowadays, in many occasions, through these treaties, we can see the blurred boundaries, of the empire or the different cities at the time. They will transform one citizen in a non-citizen. They will convert one group of people in a people who should not be, addressed, start a relationship of commerce, etc. They were supported not only by the good faith, that is a very good, the bona fides was a very, very important consideration for the Romans here, but also by ritual, oath-taking, sacrifice, publicity, and memory. So here we are talking about a concept that also normally comes from private law, that is the good faith, with a very public performative concept, that is the rituals, these oath-takings, and this publicity, in the sense of like these treaties should be signed in a very public and memorable way. It's the way that you have people to remember them and to respect them in a way. Oaths also were very important because they placed political promises also with a religious moral framework. So to break an oath actually is not only to violate an agreement, it could also be framed as impious, dishonorable, or dangerous. So it's a way to basically damage your reputation. And that actually, in this sort of like antiquity context, is not a great thing. It's like a way that not to have any people making alliances with you. Gifts are another diplomatic instrument. They can express friendship, hierarchy, reciprocity of subordination. But gifts were very ambiguous, as they are nowadays. Like nowadays, when we receive a present from a friend, sometimes it's a trap, right? Because you think, should I reply with a gift that costs the same amount of money? Should I just say thanks? You know, this is very problematic as well. What we read, for example, from Greek literature is like the Greeks are not that organized in that. It doesn't matter if one present matters is more valuable than other, etc. But the Persians, for example, they had like a norm. They said like, according to the writers, they said that their gifts should be the best, the most flamboyant. They always should be better. So this shows that probably if you're involved in diplomacy with the Persians, that will mean that you're in an endless queue of like getting super valuable presents and never reaching this kind of like luxury that they were giving to you. But their idea is like they always need to have the last word in terms of gifts, right? So yeah. So when you think about the Persians, think about this friend that gives you a very expensive present and you don't know how to replicate. So, and finally, hostages, I have mentioned them already, is a very striking instrument from modern perspective. They could secure treaties, truces, safe conduct, or political loyalty. But basically, what I wanted to show you with these instruments is that ritual, power and law were not separate spheres. They work all together. A treaty without force may be fragile. Force without ritual may appear illegitimate for the peoples who are witnessing that scene. And ritual without a political backing might be ineffective. Think again about the painting I showed at the beginning. You can do this ritual of telling the message to Antiochus. You can draw the circle, but without the political backing of your Roman army, who have just defeated a whole army in a battle, they will not be effective. So ancient diplomacy existed precisely in this very complicated combination that actually makes it fascinating from my point of view. So to get into more complexity here, one of the most important arguments that I would like to add is like diplomacy operated in a legally plural world. Like before, like Jacob has also mentioned that when you have talked about Mataix, actually that this idea of that the actors involved, they in diplomacy, they just not move in a one single legal order. They navigate in overlapping systems of law, custom, religion, and political expectation, ritual, and social sanction. For example, the case if you don't follow an oath, then you will have a change on your reputation and social sanction on that. So this is why understanding the dichotomy between law and non-law is very important. Many diplomatic practices were not enforced by courts or central institutions. They were enforced by reciprocity, reputation, fear, retaliation, etc. Also, it's very important, the public and private divide, because, well, this is a general problem that goes from space organization to law to many other things in the ancient world. The divide between public and private is not clear. It's very blurry, especially because many practices used in diplomacy, they are imitations of what they do in private practice, for example. Like when we think, for example, of the occupation of foreign lands in the case of a war, like a spoils of war, this actually, according to Gaius, a jurist who was like a professor of law in the 2nd century, and he writes this source book for students, so he explains in a very simple way. He compares the practice of occupating an object that doesn't belong to anyone, like, for example, fishing or like hunting, to when you occupy the spoils of war of a land, of a country that you have just conquered. The fact is, like, they are not exactly the same, because the fishes or the thing that you hunt in a forest actually they are free animals. They don't belong to anyone. When the lands that you're conquering after a war, they used to belong to someone. But according to Gaius, and supposedly then according to the Roman legal mentality, the fact that there's a war and you are the winner of that war means that all this kind of previous ownership is erased, and then you are able to occupy. But what is interesting here is that they are using a private institution in order to create the framework how to operate in diplomacy and international law. So there's not an international law per se. It's basically the emulation of praxis as well. Also, for example, treaties, okay, they have ritual practice, etc. But the jurists from the 3rd century, that are the ones that speak more about this thing, they said that the way to accept them is through a contractual way that is oral. It's called esponsio, means like to give an answer. So they are actually, again, providing an emulation of a private practice to the public sphere. So these boundaries of public and private, they are not as delimited as we understand it today. And another example would be, for example, hospitality. Hospitality emulates guest friendship. So basically, how you will treat someone in your household will be the way that you treat someone when you are doing a hospitality. So ancient diplomacy was not located neatly inside public law or international law. It was a plural legal space where different normative languages interacted. But that is one of the reasons, I think, why ancient diplomacy is so useful for thinking about the history of international law more broadly. So, I'm copying from Jacob's, was there an international law in antiquity? So my answer here will be no, if you are picking, again, the modern model. If you think about sovereign states, if you think about permanent diplomacy. But if we ask whether ancient communities recognize practices that govern relations beyond their own political boundaries, then yes, there is kind of like an international law. But there were also rules, there were expectations, there were conventions, and there was the management of war and peace, for example. But these norms were not always stable. They were not always universal. They were often shaped by inequality, by violence, and by cultural misunderstanding, but they mattered. There was an expectation and there was a reciprocity. So they mattered because the actors invoked them. They relied on them to have framework to act. They manipulated them. And they accused others of violating them. So they used them as well to justify their actions. So this is why I will describe the ancient interstate order as practical before it was systematic. It was not built from abstract doctrine. It emerged from repeated practices of communication, negotiation, coercion, and settlement. So let me return to the image where I begin. The encounter between Popilius and Antiochus is a perfect example of ancient diplomacy. It is not diplomacy as a polite conversation. It's not simply war by simple means. It is a ritualized confrontation. The Roman envoy delivers a message. The king is forced to respond. The circle in the sand transforms negotiation into performance. The gesture is symbolic, but is backed by power. The scene shows why ancient diplomacy matters. It reveals that interstate order did not require modern institutions to operate. It could be produced through bodies, through words, gestures, status, and threat. The circle is not a treaty, but it creates a normative moment. It creates a deadline. Like before you reach a decision, you should not get out of this circle. It creates an expectation of compliance. So I would like to end with 3 conclusions. Well, that first, I think that ancient diplomacy was sophisticated, even if it did look like very messy and very mixed up. This sophistication lay in the flexibility, in the ritual density, in the capacity of managing relations across political and cultural boundaries. Second, that it worked through praxis rather than permanent institutions like embassies, treaties, oath gifts, and diplomatic immunity that create for a political grammar or interstate relations. And third, that studying ancient diplomacy helps us rethink the history of international law. It reminds us that legal order does not always begin with codification or doctrine. Sometimes it begins with praxis. with a repeated need to communicate, to negotiate, to restrain violence, or make promises binding. So rather than asking whether antiquity had international law in our sense, we may ask how ancient actors created order in a world without any order at all. And diplomacy is one of the best places to see that process at work. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Pardon. Thank you, Emilia, for your paper on diplomacy in the ancient Greek and Roman world as a set of norms and practices rather than law, practice including gifts, marriages, hostages, etc. And your appeal at the end to rethink international law as a historical practice when looking into the history of international law. Interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.